Breaking right now at 9:31, 6 of former President Donald Trump's co-defendants have turned themselves in at the Fulton County Jail.
So let's get you caught up on this half hour. The latest is attorney Kenneth Froh. He worked with Georgia Republicans in the weeks after the election in November of 2020 at the direction of Mr. Trump's campaign. He worked on the coordination and execution of a plan to have 16 Georgia Republicans sign a certificate declaring falsely that Donald Trump had won and declaring themselves the state's duly elected qualified electors. His bond's been set at $100,000.
Georgia attorney Ray Smith also turned himself in within the last hour or so. Smith was involved in multiple lawsuits challenging the results of the 2020 election here in Georgia. His bond has been set at $50,000. Now, this follows the surrenders overnight of David Schaefer and Kathy Latham. Schaefer is the former chairman of the Georgia Republican Party. He oversaw that meeting of the 16 GOP electors at the state capitol. Latham, on the other hand, is accused of being a fake elector, and according to the indictment, she took part in an alleged data breach of election information in Coffee County.
And former Trump lawyer John Eastman and bail bondsman Scott Hall were the first of the 19 defendants to surrender at the Fulton County Jail yesterday. Eastman's accused of coming up with the idea to overturn the election. Hall is accused of taking voting information from Coffee County. And we also now know that former lawyer for Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, will be in Atlanta later today. Giuliani is set to meet with District Attorney Fani Willis to talk about a bond agreement. He still needs to find a Georgia-based lawyer, though, to sign off on that agreement to set the terms of his release once he does surrender.
And all eyes are probably going to be on Georgia tomorrow because the former president is expected to turn himself in. His bond right now is set at $200,000, so be sure to stay with Atlanta News First on air and online as we prepare you for that day. Of course, we're going to be staying on top of this. We'll have updates sent directly to your phone as long as you have our free Atlanta News First app.